As previously discussed, the first wave of Chinese immigrants that arrived to the American West as a cheap labor force were employed as wage laborers for the mining industry in the West Coast, of course. So this gold rush eventually died down and the supply dwindled. So therefore, you had literally tens of thousands of Chinese miners now searching for new employment prospects in the West. But fortunately for them, this period happened to coincide with really one of the greatest and most important events in U.S. history, and that's the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, in the 19th century U.S. West, the railroad was a central technological development. It was really a technological wonder. It's tantamount to say how the internet is today, right? The digital age during the 21st century, the late 20th and 21st century. In other words, it changes the nation dramatically, and especially in economic terms, if you can imagine, the transport of economic goods, of labor, and so forth. Now moving with uninterrupted speed, right? Okay, so it's obviously important in westward expansion, the movement from east to the west to less known areas, even uncharted parts of the west. So again, it's hard to overstate the importance and the transformative effect of this technological wonder. Before the railroad, it was very much a arduous and sometimes perilous journey to the west. In fact, if you were a merchant or business owner and you wanted to ship stuff to the west or western regions, oftentimes you had to take it by ship and go down, south, follow the coast of the North American and then South American continent, right? And you go around Argentina and Chile, and then you end up on the west side, and then you go north until you arrive at the west coast. So obviously, that's very time consuming, not to mention costly. So the railroad construction is crucial to this commercial effort. And let's remember, when you think about the railroad, you also think about westward expansion, as we discussed, as a commercial venture, commercial expansion. So the railroad is really the backbone of that technological and economic, again, um, movement west. Now, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad actually began before the Civil War, and you had a bill passed by Congress to complete this. And there's the Civil War from 1861 to 65, so it got interrupted, but it was completed pretty much right after the Civil War. Okay, so 1869, and then you see other railroads following that, other railroad industries or companies following 1869. That is to say, the first completion. So again, now it's possible to move to the west in like a week, right? You have this uninterrupted flow of labor, material, of commodities and capital, and even information, right, going back and forth from east to west. And in a way, this technology is beginning to shrink the world. Okay, that's something we associate with the internet today, right? And modern technology, or even like jet planes today, right? Where time and space matter much less compared to pre-technological eras, like during the agrarian age, where you mostly traveled by foot, if not horse. Well, now with technology, this compression of time and space is really happening. And one thing that actually happens is the beginning of sightseeing, something we take for granted today. If you want to visit a place, far away, you hop in your car, go on the freeway. Well, that wasn't around before the railroad for the most part, unless you were of the leisure, well-to-do class and you could, maybe take a ship somewhere and visit, but sightseeing, so to speak, for leisure became possible because you could go from east to west in a week or so, like I mentioned. Okay, so the railroad gets built. The federal government, as I mentioned, sees this as an economic imperative, as a national goal. They issue bonds and they grant the best land in the West to the railroad companies. And really, you see two main railroad companies contracted and competing with each other to build the Transcontinental Railroad. These were the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad companies. Okay, the Union Pacific would go on to employ mostly cheap labor comprised of Irish immigrants, as opposed to the Central Pacific Railroad, who would favor Chinese labor. Now, it deserves mention here that the hiring of Chinese labor for the railroad completion was at first debated. These captains of industry um, didn't think that the Chinese could actually do the intensive back-breaking work that's associated with this railroad completion, right? Why? Well, there was this enduring notion of, quote, Oriental persons around that were believed by the railroad employers, as well as most Americans, to be frank, about Oriental people, right? And then specifically Chinese men, if you look at it in gendered terms. That is to say, Oriental men are seen as weak, as effeminate, as even lazy and devious. Okay, these were stereotypes about Oriental people. And many doubted that the Chinese had the physical strength, in other words, for doing all that work, like laying down tracks. You had to clear the land, you had to dynamite areas, and it was very dangerous. So this brings us to a topic that's associated with that gender misconception. Okay, and I'll return to this slide later, but this is the idea of Orientalism. Okay, I'm skipping ahead on the slide, but I just want to show you this ideology. Okay, Orientalism was taken for granted as a worldview back then in the 19th century and going into the 20th century. I have to say today it's less believed in, much less actually. But going back to the 19th century, um, Orientalism was something subscribed by most people in the Western world. Now, what is Orientalism? Orientalism is the belief that since the world is divided into two fundamental areas, that's the West and the East. Okay, the East being the Orient, the West being the Occident. And by the way, the spelling for Occident is Occident, Occident. So there's the Oriental world and the Occidental world. So when you go to the East, the Oriental world, it's comprised of, let's say, Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and even stretching into India and what we call the Middle East today. And that's opposed to the Western world, which is, predominantly European. And that certainly counts the United States by this time. Now, it was believed in Orientalism that because of this fundamental division, the cultures and the people, the how they look physically, in the Oriental world, for example, their language, which sounded harsh and very foreign to most Western ears, um, the food, the just in general, the culture, right, was so different to the Western worldview that it was felt that, these are opposites. The Oriental world and the Occidental world, along with its cultures and racial groups, were fundamentally opposed to each other. So this is, in a way, oppositional, Orientalism, right? It believes in the opposition of the East and the West. So, because of this, you have this creation of a binary opposite, right? One side versus the other. And a corollary to this, an extension of the logic behind Orientalism, is that you can't really take a person from the Oriental world and place them in the Occidental world, in the Western world, and expect that Oriental person to assimilate to the West because they're so different. And vice versa. You can't take an Occidental person and place them in the Oriental world and expect the Westerner to become, quote, Oriental, right? So this is a belief held and widely subscribed to back then, Orientalism. You have to remember, this is before, the widespread availability of education, right, and visual images, and let alone things like movies, and people just didn't know in the Western world about the Orient. All they did is read things or heard stories about it and how strange it was and exotic. So, you could almost imagine why, though it's not just justifiable, right? But you can imagine why a Westerner would believe in Orientalism. Now, because it was felt that Asians or Orientals were fundamentally opposed, fundamentally different to the Western world, and furthermore, that they could not truly assimilate, it was felt that persons of Asian descent were perpetual foreigners, to use a term by academics today. Okay, that's to say they're forever outside of the nation. They're not truly American. Okay, nor could they become American through, say, naturalization, let alone citizenship. It's just conceptually impossible according to Orientalism. Okay, so you could probably see the consequence of this, what it's going to lead to, the implications. But let's go back to the railroad. Not all of these are railroad. This is mining here, but these other ones are railroad workers. And the Chinese, again, working for the Central Pacific Railroad Company, would soon become the backbone of that company's labor crews, construction crews. The Chinese, would provide the bulk of the labor, not only for the unskilled tasks, by the way, but for the highly demanding and dangerous ones, involving, like I said, TNT and explosives. One dangerous job, by the way, was to lower the Chinese worker, for the top of a cliff, and for that worker to lay dynamite in certain areas that they wanted to clear, and then they had to haul that person back up after that lowered worker had to light the dynamite fuse. So oftentimes they didn't raise that person back away from danger in time, and the person died. Okay, so it's dangerous work. Okay, but the whole point here is that the Chinese disprove that Orientalist stereotypes, the gendered sort of depictions of them as being too weak and too effeminate, right, and too lazy. Indeed, the Chinese would comprise 90% of the labor force for the Central Pacific Railroad. You had close to 10,000 Chinese laborers working on the railroad for the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Okay, so it's important to note here that they did all this work, and here's an important thing to remember: they're cheap labor. They're being paid less than the average American worker, and in fact, that's why you had Western recruiters in the Guangdong province seeking them as laborers, because they know that they could exploit them for much cheaper wages. So they're underpaid employees. They're paid less than half for their work than their American counterparts. Okay, less than half of the wages of the American worker. And they're obviously being exploited economically, even though when you look at it, they're poor in the first place, so the Chinese, that is. So they're thinking, hey, this is a windfall, and I'm sending this home and saving it, and it does help them. But here's the thing. Um, because they're being paid less than half the wages. Eventually, and I mentioned this earlier, that eventually you're going to see white laborers um, see the Chinese workers as competition, since they were indeed cheap labor. Okay, so that's going to give rise to increasing racial hostility and racial antagonism, beginning through the pretty much after the Civil War. Okay, and by the way, here's a slide here: the invisibility of Chinese railroad workers. Now, the Central Pacific Railroad Company completed their first uh, route in Promontory Point, Utah, a famous event in 1869. And here's a famous photograph taken, right? You see them. There's other photographs like, nailing in the last spike on the railroad. And certainly these people here in this famous photograph, I'm sure you have the railroad owners here, some of the workers here. But also, let's remember, 90% of the labor force were Chinese. The Chinese laborers were told to leave when they were about to take the photograph. They did not want to include them in this famous photograph. Okay, so there you go. This is a theme. If anything, it's a metaphor for the Asian worker, that they're needed but not wanted. Okay, and in this case, when the railroad was completed, they basically said, okay, here, they didn't even give them wages, or excuse me, transportation fare to go from one place to the other, right? They just said, okay, thanks for providing this hard labor for less than half of the wages. And you could only imagine how much the Central Pacific Railroad Company saved on their wage costs, right? How much it ballooned their profits, right? Because of the Chinese.